Hi all, welcome to episode 4 of my Ariana Grande series, which is called Eternal Sunshine, the Anthology of a Saturn Return. This is a continuation from episode 3, which is called What Ariana Survived, where I kind of go over all the events that led up to the events of Eternal Sunshine, so I would recommend watching that episode first before diving into this one. This episode is about attachment wounds, vulnerability, trauma patterns, and the collapse that a Saturn return can provoke. Once again, these episodes are not to excuse Ariana's behavior or absolve her of any wrongdoing or to even slander Dalton. It's just, and it's also not like for speculation. The purpose of this series is to contextualize patterns and hopefully help you guys better understand her and maybe even better understand yourselves. So let's get started. So after Pete Davidson, the passing of Mac Miller, the Manchester attacks, the Sweetener 101 show tour, I really believe Ariana Grande was pretty much cracked open. I think her relationship with Pete Davidson probably was a situation of like two dysregulated people mirroring each other. Pete Davidson has spoken about struggling with borderline personality disorder and with addiction. And, Ariana Grande was obviously struggling with trauma. So I think that relationship probably was pretty toxic, especially towards the ending, right? And, with Sweetener, Thank You Next, that tour, she was endlessly running and trying to numb herself from the pain. And then during the tour, you started to see visible collapse. By the end of the tour, she starts to acknowledge her PTSD symptoms publicly and likely begins the hard work of trauma therapy. But something that you guys need to understand is that trauma therapy is not something that happens immediately. Trauma therapy honestly takes years, and I can speak from experience. Like, I started trauma work maybe in 2018, and I didn't start feeling normal until like 2023. It's really arduous and hard work, and it has to be slow because of how tender it is. So that's something I think that you guys need to kind of understand, to understand why, despite the fact that she's started treatment, maybe still was doing things that were not ideal or were perceived to be not ideal, okay? I'm not sure exactly when Ariana Grande met Dalton, but she certainly met Dalton sometime in 2019 when a lot of these wounds were still very much raw. When you're in the beginning stages of trauma therapy, that is a very tender and vulnerable time. And if you have a tendency towards attachment issues, this is a very vulnerable time to end up in a sort of codependent relationship situation. And I don't know what went on in that marriage, but from what I saw in Position, Dalton almost became like a stability fantasy savior type that she felt like she could anchor herself into. There's some lyrics that when I was looking through Positions last night. She says in Obvious, "You're the cure for my anxiety." And then in Point of View, she says, "You know me better than I do, can't seem to keep nothing from you. I'm made of glass, you see through me." These are very intense attachment things for somebody who you've only known for a couple years. It's impossible to know a person in a year or two, or even ever, honestly. So the idea that he knew everything about her, it's sort of indicated to me a level of codependent attachment that and that where you hyper idealize love, which is kind of classic trauma bond territory. I don't know for sure though. Obviously, I was not in that relationship, so these are just my speculations. I also think that Ariana genuinely thought that she was going to retreat from private life. She actually started doing The Voice, which is something that people usually do in the legacy era of their careers. And then the pandemic hit. She did Stuck With You with Justin Bieber, which I remember that was the first time I saw Dalton for the first time, and I was like, oh, she's with somebody else. Sorry, no offense, but that's what I thought. And during the pandemic, we all wondered whether or not music in particular would ever be the way that it was again, since COVID was ripping through the population. So this is exactly the type of environment where the idea of being able to step back from the stage and step back from public life and live a private life, and as she says, switching her positions in the bed for you in the kitchen and in the bedroom, that sort of fantasy can take root and blossom. But then a wrench was thrown into that fantasy, and that wrench was Wicked, the role of a lifetime, a role that Ariana Grande has spent her entire career dreaming of. And this requires a major relocation and life-changing commitment. But she asked Dalton to join her, but he doesn't due to like real estate issues. And from Eternal Sunshine, perhaps starts behaving in perhaps what I would describe as like nefarious ways. Maybe in retaliation for her returning to the public sphere. The gap between them now started to become a fracture. This type of confrontation, that being forced to this kind of confrontation, is very Saturnian in nature. And I think the idea of having to choose between her greatest dreams versus a relationship that she was like codependent on, these are the kind of things that you have to confront. And I think that her Saturn return, not everybody's Saturn return is a total disaster. Mine was. But hers seemed to be very confronting on multiple levels. So next, let's talk a little bit about what a Saturn return is. So what is a Saturn return? Saturn is the planet of boundaries, structure, discipline, and reality checks. It takes about 29 years for Saturn to return to its natal position when the person was born, and that usually is the Saturn return, which usually happens between ages 28 and 30. Energetically, a Saturn return, if you guys are familiar with the tarot, embodies very much a tower moment, which essentially means that it'll collapse everything or anything in your life that is inauthentic, unstable, or misaligned with your true self or where you're supposed to be going. It forces you to confront the parts of yourself that are built on illusion, denial, codependency, or avoidance. And the themes of it will be confronting childhood wounds, breaking lifelong patterns that no longer serve you, choosing what you need over what you want, and seeing harsh but freeing truths about relationships, about purpose, and about identity. And it also will force you to shed patterns, coping mechanisms, attachments that are fundamentally fragile. Saturn fundamentally destroys so that you can rebuild. That is what a Saturn return is. I think Ariana Grande's Saturn Return showed up in multiple and quite violent ways. I think one of the first ways was the collapse of her marriage with Dalton. It forced Ariana to confront her pattern of codependent attachment, which was forged during a deep period of trauma recovery, and where she saw him as an anchor and a cure or a safety blanket. Booking Wicked forced a collision between her dream and a relationship that was asking her to shrink, be less, and prioritize his needs over her career and over her dreams. And the forced her to confront the incompatibility of those two kind of warring identities. And basically, the lesson of it was that the marriage could not survive what she was becoming. And in doing so, it made her confront a childhood wound. When, as she mentioned in the Zach Sang interview, when her parents divorced, left Ariana with like a fundamental attachment wound where she felt that she needed to make a marriage work no matter what. And she didn't understand that her mom leaving her dad due to the difficulty in the marriage was not actually a failure. In fact, it was a sign of strength. And she had to realize that and embody that strength in order to get herself out of a marriage that was no longer serving her. I also think one of the most important reckonings of Ariana Grande's Saturn Return was the public reckoning. I think the public commentary and backlash about her relationship with Ethan Slater, regardless of what happened behind the scenes, it really turned her into a symbol of infidelity, pattern repetition, and stealing men. People were bringing up a lifetime of previous relationships, ancient history, in order to label her as a woman who takes men, label her as a man stealer, as somebody who is taking a married man and who has had this pattern of behavior over a long period of time, whether or not the details of the actual Ethan Slater situation were exactly the same, which I don't know, they might have been, but it still forced her to have to confront that part of herself and reckon with the things that she had done in the past in the public eye. It brought accountability that she may have never have, even if it was chaotic and violent. Very Saturn in its behavior. And I think it's important because I think some people haven't been married, so they may not fully understand the magnitude of what it means to dissolve a marriage. When you get married, you swear that you are going to love somebody for the rest of your life in front of your friends, in front of your family, in front of everybody you know, and in front of the law. So it's not the same as a breakup. when you end a marriage. There is all kinds of shame, grief, idealization, the loss of the life you have. Nobody wants to become a divorcee, and there's some kind of sense of failure in that is not the same as failing in a relationship. And you could see that the stress of having, or the crumbling of her marriage was affecting her. I am not going to speculate on her body, as she specifically in this TikTok that I have photographed here asked us not to. But what I will say is it was clear that the stress of what she was going through was making it hard for her to eat, is all I'm going to say about that. In Eternal Sunshine, Ariana paints a picture of not the best husband, to be honest. She talks about emotional withholding, lying, manipulation, even cheating. In Eternal Sunshine, she says, I hope you feel all right when you're in her. And power imbalances born from her dependent. You turn off I fall asleep crying, you turn off the TV, you don't want to hear me. One more sleepless night. One day in the morning, I take my time to self-soothe. She says, I spent so much on therapy, but you didn't even try. When you finally did, it was at the wrong time. Won't abandon me again for you and I. I'm too much for you. Or also, I showed you all my demons, all my lies. You play me like Atari. Listen, the damning lyrics about the marriage are truly endless. I think one of the most incisive lines of Eternal Sunshine are in actually the title track. I love the Saturn Return interlude into Eternal Sunshine itself. That's my favorite part of the album. She says, now it's like I'm looking in the mirror. And she does this thing where she says, now we play our separate scenes. And she says, now he's in your bed laying on my chest. And she basically says, now it's like I'm looking in the mirror. I hope you feel all right when you're in her, which is a humbling reversal, right? Ariana has often been the person to do the cheating, but in this relationship, she was the one who was cheated on. And that's very Saturnian in its nature, where you're forced to mirror or see yourself in the mirror or experience the harm that you've caused to others, kind of karmic in a sense. And so the question I think many of you might be wondering is, what do I think of her attachment to Ethan? Well, I think that somebody with codependent tendencies, you don't heal codependence overnight. I think that Ethan in some ways was a bridge attachment, regardless of what his situation may have been with Lily J. He says in the extended version of intro, The End of the World, I broke your heart because you broke mine, and it's me, I'm the bad guy. I'd already grieved you when you started to realize I don't need you. I did. I wish I could unneed you, so I did. So I think that she was freeing herself from the marriage, perhaps through old patterns, by going for somebody else who might also have been perhaps unhappy in his marriage. But because that's not karmically clean, Saturn got the fuck out of her for it, with the public reckoning, and she got dragged in the media in a way that she'd never been dragged before. But with that said, I think it begs the question, do I think that her attachment to Ethan is the same sort of codependent pathology as her attachment to Dalton? Well, no, I don't think so. I think that during Positions, if you listen to that album, there's a lot of kind of codependent language in it, as I mentioned previously. However, in Eternal Sunshine, the language is less codependent and more human, more realistic. I think this is exemplified by a song like Imperfect for You, or even Warm, where she says, I'm cool on my own, but I'm warm in your arms. And she says, messy and imperfect for you, messy, I'm imperfect for you. Like, you basically, like, I'm so much less anxious when I'm with you. You're not curing my anxiety, but you're somebody who I can be human with and imperfect with. So it seems to me perhaps to be a more healthy attachment. I don't know if it's like, obviously the ideal thing would be for her to be able to like heal herself completely on her own, but Rome wasn't built in a day. Like, especially like therapeutic progress, it's microscopic, very slow steps, and especially trauma work. Trauma work is incredibly slow and arduous. You do not lose all your pathologic patterns overnight, It's a slow process. And I do think that her Saturn return, she paid for it big time. The way that she was getting dragged, that was actually the year I got married. 2023 girl, they were talking to her like she was the W of Babylon girl. It was bad. It was bad. But in any case, I think it's a portrait of a wounded woman who's learning to attach in a more healthy way. It may not be perfect, but at least it was better. I also think that the most important aspect of this album was the work that she did on herself and her relationship with the public. Ariana had never been reckoned with in the public eye previously, because she had previously been able to get away with her sins because of maybe sort of childlike idealization and various reasons I talked about in episode 2, right? But in Eternal Sunshine, she really reckons with the relationship she has with the public. For instance, in songs like True Story and Yes and, she's got a more sort of harsh or angry, kind of defiant relationship with the public, where, you know, why do you care who's whatever I ride, why? Or I'll be the villain if you need me to, I know how this goes, yeah, you know what I mean? But then in songs like We Can't Be Friends, the pain is so much more tender. She says, we can't be friends, but I'd like to just pretend. You cling to your papers and pen. I'll wait until you like me again. I'll wait for your love. You know, it's so kind of raw and tender, and she knows that, like, the public's ire is fickle, and perhaps one day she hopes it'll circle back to her, which I do believe it has. And she indicates that she knows that she can't really share her truth. She says, me and my truth, we sit in silence. Baby girl, it's just me and you. You know, so basically, you know, she's unlearning to have to rely on this sense of public validation. And she's just patiently waiting, as opposed to being desperate for that public validation. She's just said, I'll just wait until you like me again. It indicates a certain level of internal resolve and a sense of internal worth that is no longer external. And that's exactly the type of lesson that Saturn will leave you with. I think the most incredible song on Eternal Sunshine actually comes from the deluxe Brighter Days Ahead. It's Hempstead. She says, I left my heart at a pub in Hempstead, which is a vivid imagery of what seems to be the night that the marriage ended, which I think that these photos that I have above and below me are actually of that night, especially if you look at the look in Dalton's eyes and look in her eyes. It's actually, like, hard to look at, to be honest. She said, I threw my reputation, but I saved us more heartache. And which is basically, she's saying that letting go of the relationship was a form of mercy. But then she shifts her perspective to talking to the public. She says, quite frankly, you're still wrong about everything. So far off, your seat's nowhere near the table. And, you know, she says, I find something cute in your peculiar behavior. I think to be so dumb must be nice, you know? Basically, it's a pretty incisive critique of the public and the way that they've judged her relationship without actually knowing what was going on the inside, you know? My favorite moment of the song is actually the chorus, where she says, what's wrong with a little bit of poison? Which sometimes, like, something toxic can be medicine. Like Coumadin, for instance, has been used to, like, poison people for, like, centuries, but it's also medicine that for people with clotting disorders can save lives. Same with digoxin. It'll help people with cardiac arrhythmias, but in high doses, it's poison. So what's wrong with a little bit of poison? And I love that she goes, fear me, stranger, a little bit of sugar and danger, as she, like, so subtly references her past selves in Sweetener, in Dangerous Woman. And basically, it's a form of, like, reclaiming her old self without shame. And she says, I'd rather be seen alive than dying by your point of view. And I think that that's both to Dalton and to us, you know? She basically said that she would rather be seen as imperfect than dying because of what the public wants from her or what Dalton wants from her, which is kind of a beautiful thing. It shows strength and the will to survive, and I think that that's powerful, regardless of what it cost, to be honest. Maybe that's a controversial opinion. So, in conclusion, Eternal Sunshine is not a divorce album. It's not like a scandal cleanup. What I really think Eternal Sunshine is a spiritual reckoning. I think the album is a documentation of Ariana Grande for once finally choosing herself over marriage, over men, over the public's opinion, over being loved, over being understood, or even being forgiven. I think it's not about perfection, it's about emergence. And the truth of the matter is that the human experience is highly, highly imperfect when we are honest with ourselves. It is very easy to judge people for their actions and for the things they did. And it's not that there's no such thing as morality and like, oh, this person should be like totally absolved. No. And hopefully that's not what you got out of these videos, you know? But it's that there is humanity there and there are reasons, even if they may hurt others. And also, I think the universe has a way of reckoning with us when we do continue to make decisions that hurt others. But in that reckoning is a lesson. And I think that this is a story of a woman who survived everything and figured out how to stay alive on her own terms in her own life, regardless of what other people say or think. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed making it. So I'll see you on the next one. I'll see you later. Bye.